The sharp sound of a silver oyster fork striking a crystal champagne flute halted the string quartet. 80 guests seated under a sprawling sailcloth tent on the lawn of a historic Bristol estate turned their heads. The coastal breeze coming off Narragansett Bay stopped. My father, Richard Cole, stood directly in front of the sweetheart table. He did not hold a microphone. He held a thick manila envelope. He dropped it squarely between my dinner plate and my new husband Julian's hand. The package landed with a flat, undeniable thud against the white linen tablecloth. "It is time we settled up," Norabel Richard announced. His voice carried pitched to ensure the surrounding tables heard every single syllable. Julian shifted his weight. His hand found my knee under the table, his thumb tracing my knuckles in a steady, calming rhythm. I did not flinch. I slid my thumbnail under the unsealed flap of the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of Cole Realty corporate letterhead. The paper was heavy, expensive cardstock. At the bottom, aligned in perfect Arial font, sat a bolded total: $315,000. Underneath the number, a typed memo read, "Parental expenses, payable upon marriage." 80 pairs of eyes burned into my profile. I could hear the catering staff freeze near the buffet. 2 tables away, my mother Evelyn sat swirling a vodka martini, her lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. My younger sister Serena held her phone at chest level, the camera lens pointed directly at my face, waiting for me to break. They expected tears. They expected me to fold. But before I show you the document I pulled from my own white satin clutch to hand back to him, you need to understand the architecture of a $315,000 shakedown. Welcome to Revenge Order. I am Norabel Cole. I am 32 years old. How old are you? Drop your age and your city in the comments below. If you have ever had a toxic family member disguise an extortion attempt as parental guidance, this story will resonate. Hit the subscribe button so you do not miss how this ends. For the past decade, I have worked as a forensic accountant in Providence, Rhode Island. I untangle corporate fraud, pierce shell companies, and locate the capital desperate men try to bury. I build timelines out of bank statements. It is a highly specialized skill set. I did not learn it in a university lecture hall. I learned it at a mahogany dining table in a colonial house on the East Side, watching my father track my childhood on a yellow legal pad. Richard ran a mid-tier commercial development firm. To the local country club, he portrayed a pillar of coastal wealth, wearing cashmere sweaters and driving German sedans. Inside our walls, he operated as a warden. Every dollar spent on me was categorized as a depreciating corporate asset. I remember a specific Tuesday morning when I was 12. I sat at the kitchen island chewing a piece of dry, unbuttered toast. The rough edges scratched the roof of my mouth. Richard had drawn a harsh red line through the grocery column on his legal pad that morning. He tapped his gold pen against the paper. "Margins are tight, Norabel," he said, adjusting his tie. "You have exceeded your caloric budget for the week. We need to rein in the overhead." Across the Marble Island, my younger sister Serena ate a steaming plate of takeout pad thai. The rich scent of peanut sauce and lime filled the kitchen, making my stomach cramp. Serena did not have a column on the pad. She was the golden child, exempt from the ledger. She twirled a noodle around her fork and offered me a pitying smirk. My mother Evelyn stood by the espresso machine, adjusting her pearl earrings in the reflection of the microwave. "Your sister has a faster metabolism," Evelyn offered, turning her back to me. That was the extent of her maternal protection. Justify the inequality, protect the aesthetic. I stopped crying over the yellow pad by the time I was 14. Instead of absorbing the rejection, I studied his methodology. I learned to strip the emotion from the math. While other teenage girls kept diaries with lock and key, I opened a hidden folder on our desktop computer. I digitized my survival, categorizing my family dynamics into encrypted spreadsheets. Tracking the blatant disparities became my defense mechanism. If I could calculate the lack of love, it could not hurt me. What my father failed to realize is that an analog legal pad is sloppy. It leaves a paper trail. Lately, that trail had grown obvious to anyone paying attention. If you drove down Point Street this past spring, you would notice the Cole Realty signs staked in front of empty commercial lots. The paint on the edges was peeling. The iron posts flaked with orange rust. Unreplaced signs are the first symptom of a drying cash flow. Richard needed capital. His tailored suits hit a rotting foundation. Yet dropping an invoice at a wedding reception is a symptom of end-stage desperation. A man does not burn his public image unless he has run out of private victims to bleed dry. To trace the origin of that $315,000 bill, you have to rewind to the first time you put a price tag on my future. It was the spring of my senior year in high school. The acceptance letter from a prestigious university in Boston sat on the kitchen counter. For normal families, an acceptance letter is a reason to open champagne. For Richard Cole, it was a leverage opportunity. He called me into his home office. The room smelled of expensive scotch and old paper. He gestured to the leather chair opposite his desk and slid a formal, typed document toward me. He called it a promissory note. That single sheet of paper became the original sin of our relationship, establishing a financial trap that took me 14 years to escape. I stepped into my father's home office, holding the thick, embossed acceptance folder from a premier university in Boston. The room always smelled of expensive scotch and lemon oil wood polish. Dust motes drifted through the slatted afternoon light, cutting across his mahogany desk. Richard sat in his high-backed leather executive chair. He did not look up from his computer monitor when I walked in. He let me stand there, holding my future in my hands, until he decided to acknowledge my presence. When he finally turned his attention to me, he did not offer a smile or a word of congratulations. He opened his top drawer, pulled out a crisp sheet of paper, and slid it across the polished wood surface. It was a contract. I picked it up. At the top of the page, bold letters spelled out promissory note. Below that heading, the text detailed a strict financial arrangement. Richard Cole agreed to remit payment for 4 years of undergraduate tuition. In exchange, Norabelle Cole agreed to repay the principal amount in full, commencing 6 months after graduation. Capital requires a return. Norabelle, he said, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt, I am willing to fund this educational venture, but you need to understand the value of $1. Consider this an interest-free loan from the Bank of Dad. A lesson in fiscal responsibility. My mother, Evelyn, hovered near the doorway. She sipped a cup of herbal tea from a delicate porcelain saucer, her face arranged in an expression of mild boredom. She nodded in agreement with him, her jewelry clinking softly. Neither of them mentioned the academic scholarship I had earned to cover half the cost. Neither of them mentioned that normal parents do not treat their 18-year-old daughters like corporate debtors. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The Boston University was my only ticket out of Rhode Island. It was my only escape hatch from the suffocating, transactional dynamic of the Cole household. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting next to his keyboard. I did not argue. I pressed the tip to the signature line and signed my name. A week later, I walked past his office and stopped dead in my tracks. Richard had taken the promissory note, placed it in a matte black frame, and hung it on the wall, right next to his real estate awards. It was a trophy, a physical, daily reminder of his control over my future, waiting on the wall like a loaded gun. I packed my bags, moved into my dorm in Boston, and breathed free air for the first time in my life. I threw myself into my accounting courses. I thought the contract was a heavy burden, but I believed the trade-off was worth the education. Then November arrived. The air in Boston turned bitter and sharp. I was sitting in the campus library when an email pinged on my phone from the university bursar. Final notice of delinquency. My heart hammered against my ribs. I packed my backpack, sprinted across the quad, and stood in line at the financial aid office. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I handed my student ID to the clerk behind the glass partition. She typed on her keyboard, clicked her mouse, and spun the monitor around so I could see the screen. Your account is in arrears, Miss Cole, the clerk said in a flat, administrative tone. No payments have been remitted for the fall semester. If the balance is not cleared by Friday, your enrollment will be suspended. I stared at the red numbers on the screen. The balance was entirely unpaid. I walked out of the administration building and sat on a freezing concrete bench. My breath plumed in the cold air. I pulled out my laptop and logged into the public tax portal. Even as a freshman, I understood the basics of corporate deductions. I searched for Cole Realty. I pulled my father's recent filings. The sickening clarity washed over me. Richard had claimed my full tuition as a dependency deduction to offset his capital gains. He took the tax break, pocketed the cash, and never sent a single dime to the university. He used the phantom payment to shield his real estate profits, leaving me holding the bag. The framed promissory note on his wall was not a loan agreement. It was a prop. Thanksgiving break arrived 2 weeks later. I sat at the dining table in Providence, pushing a piece of turkey around my plate. Richard held court at the head of the table, bragging to my uncle about the astronomical cost of funding my higher education. "It is a heavy lift," Richard boasted, swirling his wine glass, "but we are making the sacrifice, setting the girl up for success." Serena lounged in the chair next to me. She complained loudly that the heater in her private high school was drying out her skin. Evelyn immediately handed Serena a platinum credit card, instructing her to book a weekend spa trip to Vermont to recover from the stress. 0 contracts, 0 framed notes, just pure, unfiltered indulgence. I sat there and listened to my father play the martyr. I did not throw my water glass. I did not scream that I knew about the tax fraud. Instead, I played his game. I returned to Boston and walked straight into the Federal Student Loan Office. I quietly took out crippling loans in my own name to cover the tuition he promised to pay. I secured a job as a barista working the opening shift at 5 in the morning. I took a second job tutoring underclassmen in statistics. I paid my own rent. I bought my own textbooks. One night, sitting in the quiet corner of the campus library, I opened a new encrypted spreadsheet on my laptop. I titled it The Ledger. In row 1, I logged the fake promissory note hanging on his wall. In row 2, I logged the actual federal loans burdening my credit score. Column by column, I tracked the exact dollar amount of their hypocrisy. The next 4 years were a relentless grind. I did not go to parties. I did not take spring break trips. I studied the mechanics of money. I learned how people hide it, how they launder it, and how they use it to bind other people to their will. I graduated at the top of my class. I sat for the CPA exam and passed on the first try. I immediately pursued my forensic accounting certifications, mastering the art of piercing corporate veils and tracing hidden assets. I moved back to Providence, securing a lucrative position at a prestigious downtown firm. I bought a modest, quiet condo on the edge of the city. I achieved total financial independence before my 25th birthday. Richard still believed he held the sword over my head. At family dinners, he would point his fork at me and mention the framed contract in his office. "Once you get settled, we need to discuss a repayment schedule for that tuition," he would say, a smug grin playing on his lips. "We will settle up eventually, Richard," I would reply, offering a tight, unreadable smile. I knew the truth. I knew he paid nothing. But I let him keep the frame on his wall. I let him believe he owned my debt, because a predator who thinks you are weak will never see the trap you are building under his feet. He viewed me not as a daughter, but as a corporate asset to be leveraged. I realized my presence in that family was nothing more than a line item he could exploit. I thought escaping his house meant escaping his ledger. I was wrong. The real extortion was waiting for me to build a net worth stealing. I met Julian Pierce on a rainy Tuesday in late October, far away from the polished country clubs and manicured lawns of my family. I was conducting a field audit for a local marina client down by the Narragansett Bay seawall. Julian walked into the harbor cafe, smelling of salt spray cedar and rain. He was a marine biologist, 34 years old, spending his days tracking coastal erosion and tidal patterns. He possessed a quiet, steady rhythm. His hands were calloused from working rigging lines and handling equipment in freezing water. He wore canvas jackets and faded denim, unbothered by designer labels or social climbing. Julian represented everything my family despised, which is exactly why I found him so compelling. We shared a table because the cafe was crowded, and within an hour, I realized he was the most grounded human being I had ever encountered. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words held weight. Julian quickly became my narrative anchor. As we started dating, he stepped into my world of corporate ledgers and high-stakes accounting without a flinch. He observed the Cole family dynamics from a quiet distance. He saw the theatrical wealth my father projected. He noticed the sharp, dismissive comments my mother made over Sunday dinners. He watched Serena parade around in luxury clothing, funded by invisible accounts. Julian never tried to fix my family. He simply provided a safe harbor where I did not have to calculate my worth on a spreadsheet. My career at the downtown Providence accounting firm thrived. I earned a promotion to senior forensic auditor, securing a corner office with glass walls overlooking the city skyline. I spent my days dissecting fraudulent financial statements and tracing hidden offshore accounts. I built a formidable reputation for finding truth in the numbers. That professional peace shattered on a Thursday afternoon. Julian had stopped by my office to bring me a sandwich for lunch. We were sitting on the low leather sofa in my corner suite discussing his recent water quality reports when the heavy glass door swung open. No knock, no warning from the receptionist. My mother stepped onto the plush carpet. Evelyn wore a stark white silk blouse carrying a quilted designer handbag that cost more than a reliable used car. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood threshold. She carried a thick manila folder tucked under her arm. "Norabelle, darling," she sang, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that immediately put my nerves on high alert. She breezed into the room, barely registering Julian sitting on the sofa. "I need a tiny favor. It will only take 2 seconds." Evelyn dropped the folder onto my glass desk. She opened it, revealing a dense 30-page legal document. She had already placed neon sticky flags on 4 different signature lines. It was a residential lease agreement. I stood up from the sofa, walked over to my desk, and scanned the front page. The property was a luxury loft in the Jewelry District, a highly coveted neighborhood in downtown Providence. It featured exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling windows, and concierge service. I traced my finger down to the financial terms. The monthly rent was $5,500. "Serena is moving out," I asked, keeping my tone level. "She is launching her new aesthetic brand," Evelyn explained, waving her manicured hand as if swatting away a fly. "She needs a premium backdrop for her content creation. Her followers expect a certain standard of living. That dingy guest room at our house simply does not photograph well in natural light." Serena posted pictures of iced lattes and mirror selfies. She had no verifiable income, no business plan, and no corporate registration. She was an influencer funded entirely by Richard Cole. "Okay," I replied, reading further down the page. "Why is this on my desk?" "The leasing office is being ridiculous," Evelyn sighed, crossing her arms. "They want a guarantor on the lease because Serena technically does not have a W-2 form right now. Your father has his capital tied up in a new commercial development, so his debt-to-income ratio is temporarily skewed. We need you to co-sign. Just a formality, really." I stared at the paperwork. I am a forensic accountant. I do not see formalities. I see liability. Co-signing a $5,500 monthly lease for an unemployed sibling meant I would be legally responsible for $66,000 a year. If Serena missed a payment, my flawless credit score would absorb the damage. If she damaged the luxury loft, the property management group would garnish my wages. Evelyn expected me to pick up the pen and sign. She relied on the ingrained family programming, assuming I would absorb the financial risk to maintain the peace. I picked up the thick stack of paper, tapped the bottom edge against the glass desk to align the pages, and slid the folder back across the smooth surface toward her. "No," I said. The artificial sweetness vanished from Evelyn's face. Her jaw tightened. A dark flush crept up her neck, staining her collarbone. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice dropping its melodic pretense. "I will not co-sign a luxury lease for Serena," I stated clearly, maintaining eye contact. I carry zero debt outside of my own mortgage. I am not attaching my name to an unsecured $66,000 liability. If Serena wants a premium aesthetic, she needs to secure a premium paycheck," Evelyn erupted. The veneer of coastal high society shattered, exposing the entitlement underneath. She slammed her hand against my desk, rattling my pen cup. "You selfish girl," Evelyn hissed, leaning forward. "We are a family. We support each other. You sit up here in your fancy glass office counting other people's money, and you refuse to lift a finger for your own blood. You have always been greedy, Norabel, ever since you were a child, counting pennies and keeping score. Serena needs a launch pad, and you are actively standing in her way out of pure spite." Julian remained perfectly still on the leather sofa. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to my defense. He watched my mother hurl insults with the calm, detached observation of a scientist studying a volatile weather pattern. His silent presence fortified my resolve. "My answer is no, Mom. You can take the lease and leave." Evelyn snatched the folder off the desk. She spun on her heel and marched toward the door. "You will regret this," she threw over her shoulder before slamming the glass door shut behind her. The silence in the office was immediate. I let out a slow, measured breath. Julian stood up, walked over to my desk, and handed me my half-eaten sandwich. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew I was. The retaliation began before the workday finished. My cell phone started vibrating on my desk, a relentless drumbeat of notifications. Evelyn had launched a targeted smear campaign across our extended Rhode Island family network. She sent a mass text message to my aunts, uncles, and cousins. I opened the thread. Evelyn painted a picture of a desperate, struggling sister and a cold, unfeeling elite accountant who refused to help her family survive. My phone lit up with a message from Aunt Vivian. "Family comes first, Norabel. Do not let money change who you are." Cousin Clara sent a passive-aggressive note. "I heard about the lease. Really disappointed in your lack of empathy today." The social pressure was designed to isolate me, to force me into compliance through public shame. I sat in my office chair watching the incoming judgments pile up on my screen. I felt the familiar weight of their collective disapproval pressing down on my shoulders. Julian walked up behind me. He rested his hands on the back of my ergonomic chair. He looked at the glowing screen of my phone, reading the barrage of guilt trips and manipulations. He leaned down, his voice steady and deep. "Do you want to change your phone number?" That single question broke the tension. He did not validate their anger. He did not suggest I compromise. He offered a simple, practical solution to cut the cord. I looked up at him, a genuine smile breaking across my face. "Not yet," I replied. "Let them type." I closed the messaging application. I opened my secure drive and clicked on the master spreadsheet titled The Ledger. I created a new tab. I typed in the date, the time, and a brief factual summary of the encounter. Unsecured luxury lease demand. Estimated liability avoided, $66,000. Smear campaign initiated. I saved the file. I felt secure. I had established a hard boundary and held the line against my mother's theatrics. The digital walls around my finances remained intact. I had successfully defended my credit score from my mother and sister. But late that night, a panicked phone call from my father brought a threat I couldn't ignore. My phone buzzed against the nightstand at 11:15. The caller ID displayed my father's name in stark white letters. Richard Cole rarely called me outside of business hours, and he certainly never reached out near midnight unless a crisis demanded an audience. I sat up, the sheets pooling around my waist. Julian stirred beside me, his breathing slow and even in the quiet darkness of the bedroom. I slid out of bed, walked into the hallway, and accepted the call. "I need you at the house first thing tomorrow morning," Richard said. No greeting, no preamble. His voice lacked its usual booming authority. It sounded thin, stretched tight over an underlying wire of panic. 8 o'clock sharp, Norabel. Do not be late." He disconnected the line before I could respond. The next morning, the sky over Providence hung low and gray, threatening a heavy coastal storm. I parked my sedan in the circular driveway of his colonial estate. The pristine landscaping looked slightly overgrown, the hedges losing their sharp geometric edges. I walked through the heavy oak front door and bypassed the formal living room, heading straight for his mahogany office. Richard sat behind his desk. He looked 10 years older than he had at Thanksgiving. The tailored lines of his suit jacket hung loosely on his frame. His fingers trembled slightly as he shuffled a stack of manila folders. He did not ask me to sit. "We have a liquidity issue." Richard began refusing to make eye contact. He stared fixedly at a brass paperweight shaped like an anchor. "The firm is facing a federal audit. The IRS issued a preliminary notice regarding a tax lien on the primary corporate accounts. If the lien hits, it freezes operating capital across 3 development projects." As an auditor, I understood the severity of his statement. A federal tax lien destroys a developer. It halts construction loans, panics investors, and triggers a cascading default across every active property. "How far short are the reserves?" I asked, slipping into a clinical, professional tone. $40,000, Richard stated, finally looking up. The panic in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, hard stare of a man preparing to extract what he needed. "I have leveraged everything else. I need $40,000 to clear the deficit by the end of business today." He did not frame it as a request. He presented it as a bill coming due. He leaned back in his leather chair and pointed a rigid finger at the framed promissory note hanging on his wall. "I carried the weight of your education, Norabel. I funded your foundation. Now the family needs a capital injection to protect the assets. If these accounts freeze, your mother and sister lose the house. We lose the cars. It all goes." He wielded my mother and sister as human shields. He knew I felt zero obligation to his corporate empire, but the idea of Evelyn and Serena facing sudden, brutal bankruptcy gnawed at a residual core of familial guilt. The conditioning ran deep. I knew the college tuition was a lie, but watching a man break down in front of you triggers a visceral instinct to fix the damage. "I will secure the funds," I said slowly, maintaining a neutral expression. "But this is not a gift. It is a structured loan." Richard scoffed, a short, bitter sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Write up whatever paperwork makes you feel better, accountant." I drove back to my downtown office. Julian met me there during his lunch hour. I sat at my computer and opened my brokerage account. I initiated the sale of a significant block of municipal bonds I had been holding for 3 years. It was stable, growing capital. Selling it triggered capital gains taxes on my end, increasing the cost of the rescue. Julian stood behind my chair watching the progress bar load as the wire transfer processed. The bank interface confirmed the outgoing sum. $40,000 routing directly into the Cole Realty operating account. I printed a standard commercial loan agreement. I detailed the principal amount, attached a modest interest rate to appease the IRS regulations regarding family loans, and set a repayment schedule. Julian rested his hand on my shoulder. His grip was warm and grounding. "Will you ever see that money again?" he asked quietly. I looked at the confirmation screen. "No," I replied, the truth settling heavy in my chest. "But I bought the right to never hear about the college tuition again. I paid the ransom." I messengered the loan agreement to Richard. He signed it and returned it the next day. I filed it in my desk drawer and logged the transfer into my encrypted spreadsheet under a new tab titled Actual Debts Owed. I tried to compartmentalize the loss. I told myself I had saved the family estate from the auction block. A week passed. The gray coastal weather broke, bringing clear blue skies to Rhode Island. I took an extended lunch break to drop off some audit files at a client office in Warwick. On my drive back toward Providence, I stopped at a red light near a luxury European car dealership. The massive glass showroom gleamed in the sunlight. A salesman in a sharp blue suit stood near the exit ramp, waving cheerfully to a customer driving off the lot. A brand new metallic black Range Rover rolled down the ramp and paused at the edge of the street, waiting to merge into traffic. The vehicle possessed an aggressive, flawless shine. The dealer tags were still bolted to the bumper. The tinted driver's side window lowered halfway. Serena sat behind the steering wheel. She wore oversized designer sunglasses, tapping her manicured nails against the leather-wrapped steering wheel, nodding along to the heavy bass vibrating from the premium sound system. She looked thrilled, flush with the adrenaline of a massive purchase. The light turned green. My foot remained frozen on the brake pedal. The driver behind me honked a long, blaring horn. I accelerated mechanically, my mind racing through 100 different calculations. I returned to my office and closed the glass door. I did not log into my firm's private database. I did not need special access. A vehicle that expensive requires public registration. I pulled up the Rhode Island Division of Motor Vehicles commercial search portal. I cross-referenced Serena's name with recent luxury vehicle registrations. Nothing appeared. Serena owned no property and held no verifiable credit. She could not finance a bicycle, let alone a six-figure SUV. I switched my search parameters. I entered Cole Realty, LLC. The screen populated a list of commercial assets tied to my father's primary business entity. At the top of the list sat a newly registered commercial lease agreement for a high-end sport utility vehicle. I opened the document details. The lease required a substantial upfront capital reduction payment to secure the favorable monthly terms and shield the asset under a corporate umbrella. The required down payment amount glared at me from the screen in stark black text. $40,000. My breath caught in my throat. The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. I stared at the numbers until they blurred together. Richard did not have a catastrophic IRS tax lien. The federal audit story was a fabrication. He spun a tale of imminent family ruin to bypass my logical defenses and hit the panic button. He needed liquid cash that could not be traced back to his failing accounts. He used my emergency wire transfer as a corporate down payment for a luxury vehicle. He funneled my municipal bond sale straight into the dealership to buy his golden child, the premium aesthetic she demanded. He converted my hard-earned savings into heated leather seats and a panoramic sunroof, carefully shielding the vehicle from any future corporate bankruptcy proceedings. I did not scream. I did not call his office to demand an explanation. A confrontation would only yield gaslighting and denial. Evelyn would defend the purchase as a necessary business expense for Serena's brand. Richard would laugh at the loan agreement sitting in my desk drawer. Instead, I sat in the quiet hum of my corner office and felt a cold, crystalline anger solidify in my chest. The last, lingering thread of familial obligation severed, cleanly snapping with a finality that felt almost physically light. I realized the depth of his predatory nature. He viewed my empathy as a vulnerability to be exploited. I opened my encrypted spreadsheet. I updated the notes section next to the $40,000 line item. I deleted the words IRS tax lien. I typed the vehicle identification number of a black Range Rover. The $40,000 was gone, converted into leather seats for the golden child. But the loss taught me a valuable lesson, just in time for my wedding. 2 months after the Range Rover incident, Julian drove me to the southern edge of Aquidneck Island. We parked near the rugged granite cliffs of Ocean Drive in Newport. The November wind whipping off the Atlantic Ocean carried the sharp scent of brine and damp earth. There were no hidden photographers, no curated floral arrangements, and no performative aesthetic. We stood alone on the uneven stone, listening to the heavy waves crash against the shoreline. Julian reached into the pocket of his faded canvas jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. He did not recite a rehearsed poem. He looked at me, his eyes steady and clear against the gray horizon. "I cannot promise a life free of complications," Julian said, his voice anchoring me against the coastal wind. "But I promise I will never keep a ledger on you. Everything I have is yours. No receipts required." He opened the box to reveal a simple sapphire ring flanked by 2 small diamonds. It was private. It was understated. It was perfect. I said yes, wrapping my arms around his neck, feeling a profound sense of safety I had never experienced inside my childhood home. That joy, however, was a fragile commodity. In my family, happiness displayed openly was treated as an invitation for theft. I made a tactical error the following Sunday. I allowed the residual glow of the engagement to lower my defenses during a mandatory family dinner in Providence. Evelyn inspected the sapphire on my left hand, noting the modest carat size, with a subtle, condescending sniff. She asked if I had considered any venues. I let a detail slip. I mentioned a historic botanical greenhouse on the edge of the city. I described the vaulted glass ceilings, the rare exotic ferns, and the Victorian ironwork. I named the exact Saturday in late September I hoped to secure. Evelyn stirred her iced tea. The ice cubes clinked against the crystal glass. Her gaze sharpened, calculating the data I had just handed her. Serena sat across the table, scrolling on her phone, feigning disinterest. I should have recognized the quiet shift in the room. 4 days later, I sat in my downtown office, reviewing an audit file. My desk phone chimed. The caller ID showed the Botanical Gardens main office. Miss Cole, the event coordinator, began. Her tone sounded strained, thick with professional hesitation. I am calling regarding your inquiry for the third Saturday in September. There has been a scheduling conflict. I submitted the preliminary intake form on Monday. I replied, pulling up my calendar. Did another couple hold a right of first refusal? Not exactly, the coordinator stammered. A non-refundable retainer was wired to our corporate account this morning. The party booked the entire conservatory for that specific weekend. The name on the wire transfer was Cole Realty. My fingers froze over my keyboard. The event title listed on the contract is A Premium Influencer Lifestyle Launch 4. Serena Cole, the coordinator, continued, her voice dropping to an apologetic whisper. I assumed, given the shared last name, your family was consolidating events. If this is an error, the deposit is already locked. The pieces snapped together with sickening precision. Evelyn stole my wedding date and my dream location to host a fake business party for the golden child. I did not raise my voice at the coordinator. I thanked her for her time and disconnected the line. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Evelyn. She answered on the second ring. In the background, I could hear the faint hum of a spa esthetician discussing facial treatments. Mom, I said, keeping my breathing even, I just received a very interesting phone call from the Botanical Gardens. Evelyn unleashed a breathless, dramatic sigh, executing her routine of weaponized incompetence. Oh, sweetheart, the venue coordinator must have confused the files. You told me you were only brainstorming that greenhouse. You never said it was official. Serena urgently needed a lush, tropical backdrop for her new skincare partnership announcement. You cannot expect us to halt crucial business operations just because you liked the vibe of a room. She paused. She waited for the explosion. She wanted me to weep. She craved a screaming match she could leverage into a victim narrative for her country club friends. She needed me to beg her to release the date. I offered her a cavernous, unbroken silence. Norabelle Evelyn prompted her artificial sweetness, faltering. Are you there? I am here, I replied. Enjoy the launch party. I ended the call. I set the phone face down on my desk. I refused to grant them the emotional reaction they treated as currency. Tears were a luxury they had not earned. I pivoted. I closed my current audit spreadsheet and opened a secure browser window. I bypassed public commercial event spaces and began searching for unlisted coastal properties. Within 40 minutes, I located a sprawling private estate in Bristol, situated on a secluded peninsula overlooking the bay. It featured sweeping, manicured lawns and a historic stone mansion. It was twice as elegant and far more exclusive than the greenhouse. I contacted the estate manager, wired the retainer from my personal savings, and secured the new date. I then applied forensic accounting protocols to my wedding logistics. I established a zero-trust architecture for my vendors. When I hired a caterer, a florist, and a string quartet, I inserted a specific clause into every contract. I implemented a mandatory verbal password. Any modification, cancellation, or menu alteration required my direct authorization code. I locked my family out of the infrastructure entirely. Julian arrived at my office later that afternoon to walk me to my car. He saw the color-coded logistics map displayed on my secondary monitor. I explained the botanical garden theft and my subsequent countermeasures. He leaned against the doorframe, studying my face. A slow, proud smile spread across his features. You treat your wedding planning like a hostile corporate defense strategy. Julian said, his eyes filled with quiet admiration. They tried to bait you into a war, and you just changed the battlefield. Your strategic silence is terrifying in the best possible way. My parents thrived on chaotic conflict. My refusal to fight starved them of their oxygen. Over the next few weeks, the absence of my outrage agitated them deeply. They expected a tearful confrontation over Sunday dinner. Instead, they received a polished save-the-date card in the mail, listing an estate they could never dream of affording, locked behind gates they could not control. They realized they had lost their grip on the narrative. Evelyn failed to sabotage the location, which meant Richard had to step into the ring. He saw the Bristol estate not as a celebration of my marriage, but as an untapped resource. He decided if he could not stop the wedding, he would use it to save his dying empire. Wedding planning accelerated through the spring months. The Bristol estate required precise logistical coordination. I negotiated vendor contracts, reviewed seating arrangements, and finalized the catering menu with the meticulous focus I typically reserved for corporate audits. Julian handled the logistics for the string quartet and managed the transport for our out-of-town guests. We built a tight, controlled guest list, capped at exactly 80 people. It included Julian's extended family from Maine, my closest university friends, and a small, curated circle of my Rhode Island relatives. We deliberately excluded anyone connected to Richard's business operations. On a Tuesday morning in early May, my inbox chimed with a high-priority email notification. The sender was Richard Cole. The subject line read, "Urgent Guest List Addendum." I clicked the attachment. An Excel spreadsheet opened on my monitor. I scrolled past the header row and felt a cold prickle of disbelief. Richard had generated 45 additional names. I scanned the data. These were not long-lost cousins or obscure family friends. The list read like a who is who of Rhode Island commercial real estate and gray market finance. He included 3 local zoning board politicians, a handful of high-net-worth property investors, and the principals of 2 private hard money lending firms. Below the spreadsheet, his email contained a brief, demanding paragraph. Norabelle, I reviewed the preliminary headcount for the Bristol estate. The venue possesses significant aesthetic leverage. I am inviting the attached roster. Cole Realty requires a high-profile networking gala to secure venture capital for the upcoming waterfront development project. Please adjust the catering order accordingly. I expect the presentation to reflect well on the firm. I stared at the screen. He was attempting to hijack my wedding reception and convert it into a corporate bailout mixer. He planned to parade his investors across the manicured lawns of the estate, utilizing my private celebration as a free backdrop to project an illusion of solvency. I opened the catering contract. Adding 45 guests at $200 per plate equaled an immediate $9,000 upcharge. Richard expected me to absorb the cost of entertaining his shadow lenders. I hit reply. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. Richard, the guest list is locked at 80. The catering numbers have been finalized. I will not fund a corporate networking event under the guise of my wedding reception. The 45 names attached below will not be cleared by the security gate at the Bristol estate. I clicked send. The retaliation arrived less than 48 hours later, dressed not in anger, but in velvet. Thursday evening, Julian and I were sitting in my downtown condo, reviewing the final floral budget. A sharp knock echoed from my front door. I checked the security peephole. A uniformed courier stood in the hallway, holding a sleek, black, padded envelope. I signed for the package, thanked the courier, and carried it to the kitchen island. Julian set down his pen and walked over, his brow furrowed in curiosity. I tore the heavy cardboard seal and pulled out a midnight blue velvet jewelry box. The gold embossed logo on the lid belonged to an elite jeweler located in the high-end shopping district of Providence. I popped the clasp and lifted the lid. Resting on a bed of white satin was a diamond tennis necklace. The stones were brilliant clear and massive. They caught the overhead pendant lights throwing sharp prisms of color across the quartz countertop. Tucked beside the clasp was a small, heavy card. The handwriting belonged to Richard. "For my beautiful bride, a father always provides. Wear this on your special day." Julianne let out a low whistle, leaning closer to inspect the stones. "That is not costume jewelry, Norabel. Those are real." Did he crack? Is this an apology for the guest list demand? Julian possessed a healthy, functional family. His parents resolved conflicts with honest conversations and genuine remorse. He instinctively applied normal human logic to the Cole family dynamic. I did not touch the diamonds. I stared at the velvet box as if it contained a venomous snake. "My father does not apologize," I said, my voice dropping to a clinical whisper. "He invests. This is a bribe." I picked up the necklace, feeling the cold, heavy weight of the precious metal against my palm. I estimated the retail value at minimum $15,000. My mind began to race, aligning the data points I had collected over the past 6 months. I thought about the rusted Cole Realty signs deteriorating on Point Street. I thought about the desperate midnight phone call demanding a $40,000 wire transfer to save his firm from a fictitious IRS lien. I thought about Serena driving a luxury SUV registered under a corporate lease because Richard lacked the personal credit to finance it. The man was drowning in debt. His corporate empire was an insolvent shell game. He did not possess $15,000 in liquid cash to spend on a sentimental wedding gift. A man facing imminent commercial bankruptcy does not walk into an elite jeweler and drop 5 figures on diamonds out of sudden paternal warmth. He deployed a red herring. He wanted me to look at the sparkling stones and feel a rush of guilt. He wanted the diamonds to blind me to the reality of his financial decay. He assumed the extravagant gesture would soften my defenses, forcing me to capitulate and allow his investors through the gates of the Bristol estate. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not look at a luxury asset and see a gift. I look at a luxury asset and see a transaction waiting to be audited. I set the necklace back into the velvet box and snapped the lid shut. "What are you thinking?" Julianne asked, watching the rigid tension grip my shoulders. "A narcissist doesn't buy a $15,000 necklace to apologize," I replied, pulling my laptop from my leather work bag. "They buy it to soften a target. I need to know whose money actually bought this." I carried my laptop to the dining table. I did not log into my wedding planning spreadsheets. I booted up my encrypted professional workstation. I cracked my knuckles and stared at the login screen for the Rhode Island Public Tax Portal and Commercial Property Database. The midnight audit began. The glowing numerals on my digital desk clock shifted to 2 in the morning. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my condo, the Providence skyline had gone dark, leaving only the amber glow of street lamps reflecting off the wet pavement. Inside, the only light came from the dual monitors of my workstation, casting a cold blue hue across the dining table. Julian had retreated to the bedroom hours ago, leaving me isolated in my element. The velvet box holding the diamond necklace sat pushed to the far corner of the quartz island, a glittering piece of evidence waiting to be categorized. Forensic accounting is not a cinematic montage of tumbling numbers and flashing red screens. It is an exercise in brutal patience. It requires sifting through digital archives connecting disparate data points and recognizing the negative space where money should be, but is not. Fraud always leaves a fingerprint. You just have to know which surface to dust. I started with the broad strokes. I logged into the Rhode Island Secretary of State corporate database. I typed my father's name into the registered agent query bar and hit enter. A sprawling, chaotic web of limited liability companies populated the screen. Cole Realty was merely the public-facing umbrella. Beneath it, Richard had spun up dozens of localized shell corporations. I opened a secondary window and pulled the state tax records. I began cross-referencing the corporate identification numbers with the municipal property deeds. The architecture of his decay unspooled before my eyes. Richard operated a classic corporate shell game. When a commercial development project stalled, he created a new subsidiary entity. He transferred the failing asset into the new shell, leveraging the hollow property to secure fresh, short-term loans from secondary markets. He used the new cash to pay the interest on the old debt. It was a perpetual motion machine of insolvency. I pulled up the addresses of the properties held by these phantom LLCs. I recognized the street names: Point Street, Wickenden Street, Allens Avenue. These were the exact locations of the empty commercial lots with the peeling paint and the rusted iron signs. The signs were not just neglected marketing tools. They were tombstones for bankrupt projects. His empire possessed zero liquidity. He was moving invisible money between empty buckets to outrun his creditors. I shifted my focus to the vehicle lease. I accessed the dealership financing records I had flagged months prior when I discovered Serena driving the black SUV. I traced the routing numbers attached to the monthly auto draft. The payments originated from an account titled Cole Holdings, LLC. I ran a liquidity check on that specific account. It operated on a razor-thin margin, frequently dipping into overdraft status before receiving mysterious infusions of wire transfers. The $40,000 I had sent him to cover the fictitious federal tax lien had vanished into that exact account, immediately bleeding out to cover the vehicle down payment and a dozen other past-due commercial vendor invoices. He was running on fumes. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and rubbed my tired eyes. The pieces fit together flawlessly, constructing a profile of a developer teetering on the edge of a catastrophic default. But a glaring anomaly remained. I looked across the room at the velvet jewelry box. $15,000 in retail diamonds. A man juggling overdraft fees and shell companies does not possess the discretionary capital to purchase elite jewelry. Even if he attempted to put it on a corporate credit card, his utilization ratios would trigger an immediate decline. If Richard did not have the money, and the banks would not lend him the money, where did the capital originate? In my profession, when the primary subject yields no liquid assets, you shift the spotlight to the victims in their blast radius. You look at the people they have the access and authority to exploit. I opened the Rhode Island Municipal Land Evidence Records portal. It is an archaic, clunky interface requiring precise search parameters to yield accurate returns. I bypassed the corporate queries. I selected the individual search function. I typed Norabelle Cole into the grantor-grantee search bar. I expected to see a single, clean entry. 8 years ago, fresh out of university and eager to establish my independence, I purchased the modest 2-bedroom condo I was currently sitting in. Because I was young and navigating the real estate market for the first time, Richard offered to assist with the closing logistics. He had requested copies of my W-2 forms, my state identification, and my Social Security number to prepare the preliminary binder. I trusted him then. I handed over the data without a second thought. I hit the search key. The system processed the query. The screen refreshed, displaying a small grid of recorded documents. Row 1 displayed the original warranty deed from 8 years ago. Row 2 displayed a document recorded a mere 36 months ago. My breath caught in my throat. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen suddenly sounded deafening. The document type was listed as a mortgage instrument. Specifically, it was categorized as a home equity line of credit. The principal amount attached to the filing was $150,000. I did not take out a line of credit. I owned my condo free and clear of any secondary loans. I guarded my credit score with a ruthless intensity. I clicked on the digital file, my hand hovering over the mouse. The scanned PDF loaded onto my secondary monitor. I scrolled past the standard municipal boilerplate language, my eyes hunting for the lender information. This was not a loan originated by a major national bank or a local credit union. Traditional financial institutions utilize automated monitoring systems. If a secondary mortgage hit my credit report, my identity protection software would have alerted me within 24 hours. The lender listed on the deed was a private entity, Apex Capital Lending. I recognized the name. My mind snapped back to the Excel spreadsheet Richard had emailed me 3 days ago. The guest list addendum, the 45 names he demanded I clear for my wedding reception. I pulled up the spreadsheet on my primary monitor. I scrolled down to row 28. Marcus Vance, Principal Director, Apex Capital Lending. Marcus Vance was a shadow lender. He operated in the gray market of commercial real estate. Traditional banks run credit checks. They verify income. They require extensive underwriting and personal interviews. Hard money lenders in the gray market do not care about your debt-to-income ratio. They care about collateral. They loan liquid cash at exorbitant, predatory interest rates, securing the debt against physical property. If the borrower defaults, the shadow lender forecloses and seizes the asset. They bypass the standard regulatory hurdles, making them the preferred financiers for desperate men with ruined credit scores. Richard invited the man holding a six-figure lien against my home to drink champagne at my wedding. My hands began to shake. A cold, terrifying adrenaline flooded my veins. I dragged my mouse down to the final page of the PDF document. I needed to see the execution page. I needed to see the notarized validation. I reached the bottom of the digital deed. There, stamped in black ink, was the seal of a notary public employed by Cole Realty. And resting directly above the printed name Norabelle Cole sat a signature. I stared at the looping cursive on the screen, the slant of the letters, the curve of the capital N, the sharp tail of the lowercase l. It was a masterful replication. It was the handwriting of someone who had watched me sign birthday cards, school permission slips, and college applications for 2 decades. I opened the digitized property deed and stared at a signature that looked exactly like mine, but was not. The blue light from the dual monitors reflected in the glass of the dining room windows. I sat perfectly still, staring at the forged signature on the execution page of the digitized property deed. The silence in the condo felt heavy thick with the sudden realization that the foundation of my independence had been hollowed out from underneath me. 3 years ago, my father utilized the personal data he retained from assisting with my initial condo purchase. He weaponized my Social Security number, my previous tax returns, and my state identification to commit felony identity theft. He orchestrated a massive fraud, pulling $150,000 in equity out of my home through his shadow lending network. I scrolled back up to the disbursement schedule attached to the home equity line of credit. The funds did not transfer into my personal accounts. The routing data directed the capital straight into a shell company registered under Cole Realty. He siphoned the equity I had spent 8 years building to keep his failing commercial real estate empire afloat. I checked my primary credit monitoring software. The dashboard displayed a pristine score, 0 alerts, 0 derogatory marks. The mechanics of his deception became clear. By utilizing a hard money lender who operated outside standard regulatory reporting, and by ensuring the minimum monthly interest payments were met via automatic drafts from his corporate accounts, Richard kept the secondary mortgage invisible. It never hit the major credit bureaus. It operated as a ghost liability, silently ballooning against the value of my property. I looked across the kitchen island at the velvet jewelry box. The $15,000 diamond necklace was not a gift. It was not an apology. It was purchased with my own stolen equity. He bought me off using my own money, assuming the sparkling stones would blind me to the rot beneath his corporate facade. I pushed my chair back from the workstation. The wheels scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up, walked down the short hallway, and pushed open the bedroom door. Julian lay asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The bedside lamp cast a soft yellow circle of light across the nightstand. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "Julian," I whispered. He woke immediately. The disorientation lasted only a fraction of a second before his eyes focused, reading the rigid tension in my posture. He did not ask what time it was. He threw off the quilt, swung his legs over the edge of the mattress, and followed me out to the dining area. I pulled up a second chair next to my workstation. I pointed to the primary monitor displaying the forged execution page. "Read the lender information," I instructed, my voice flat and clinical. "Then read the signature." Julian leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. He scanned the dense legal text. His brow furrowed as his mind processed the municipal formatting. He traced the line from the principal loan amount down to the notary seal and the forged cursive script. His posture stiffened. The relaxed demeanor of a man pulled from sleep vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened focus. Julian understood the implications of a gray market lien. "He mortgaged your home," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned his head to look at me, his jaw set in a tight line. "He forged your signature and took out a 6-figure loan against your property." $150,000, I confirmed, tapping the screen. He funneled the cash into a shell LLC to cover his commercial overdrafts. The lender is Marcus Vance. Vance is on the guest list addendum Richard emailed me on Tuesday. He wants to bring the man holding a fraudulent lien against my condo to drink our champagne at the wedding reception. Julian stood up. He paced the short distance between the dining table and the kitchen island, his hands running through his hair. He stopped in front of the velvet jewelry box, staring at the diamonds glittering under the pendant lights. He understood the connection without me having to explain it. He turned back to face me. The protective instinct radiating from him was palpable. "We need to contact the authorities," Julian stated, his tone leaving no room for debate. "This is felony bank fraud. This is severe identity theft. Do we call the police right now? I will drive you to the precinct. We file the report tonight." The dramatic irony of the situation settled over the room. The audience knows the truth. They know a devastating crime has been committed. They know the Cole family patriarch is not a wealthy developer, but a desperate felon walking a tightrope of shadow debt. I looked at Julian. I appreciated his instinct to deploy immediate justice. Normal people call the police when they discover a crime. But I am not normal. I am a forensic accountant. I understand how financial criminals operate when they feel the net closing around them. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "We do not call the police tonight." Julian stopped pacing. He looked at me, confusion warring with his anger. "Norabel, he stole your equity. If he defaults on those minimum interest payments, Marcus Vance can initiate foreclosure proceedings on this condo. You could lose your home." "I know," I said, pointing to the cascading web of LLCs displayed on my secondary monitor. "But if I call the police right now, a detective knocks on Richard's door tomorrow morning. The moment he realizes an investigation is active, he will initiate emergency asset protection protocols. He will scrub his hard drives. He will transfer whatever liquid cash he has left into offshore holding accounts. He will instruct his corporate lawyers to bury the paper trail under a mountain of injunctions." I walked over to the kitchen island and snapped the velvet jewelry box shut. The sharp click echoed in the quiet condo. If I strike now, he has time to build a defense. I continued, turning to face Julian. He will leverage my mother to testify that I gave him verbal authorization. He will weaponize Serena to launch a public smear campaign claiming I am trying to destroy the family business over a misunderstanding. I will spend the next 5 years fighting him in civil court while Vance attempts to seize my property. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. He watched me with a quiet, intense focus, waiting for the alternative. "I do not want a lengthy legal battle," I stated cleanly. "I want an execution. I want to dismantle his corporate infrastructure so thoroughly he can never borrow another dime in the state of Rhode Island." "How?" Julian asked softly. "I use his own arrogance against him," I explained, walking back to my workstation. I closed the municipal database and opened a fresh, blank, encrypted file folder. He believes he holds all the leverage. He thinks dropping an invoice at my wedding reception will force my compliance. He assumes the public pressure of a networking gala will guarantee my silence. I began dragging the downloaded PDF files, the tax records, and the IP address logs into the new folder. I'm going to compile every piece of evidence into a single physical dossier, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I will let him walk into the reception. I will let him drink the champagne. I will let him drop his fake bill on my plate in front of 80 guests. I looked up at Julian. A slow, grim smile spread across my face. And then I concluded, I am going to hand the forensic proof of his felony bank fraud directly to Marcus Vance. I will let the shadow lender destroy him." Julian stared at me for a long moment. He did not flinch away from the cold calculation in my eyes. He nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement. "Okay, Julian," agreed, his voice dropping to a low, steady register. "We do it your way. Tell me what you need me to do." I had the evidence to send my father to federal prison. Now I just needed the perfect stage to execute the sentence. And he was building it for me. The laser printer in my home office hummed a steady, rhythmic drone. I stood over the output tray, watching page after page of high-grade bond paper slide into a neat stack. The air smelled of hot toner and ozone. Forensic accounting relies heavily on digital tracing, but executing a financial kill shot requires physical weight. A digital file can be ignored, minimized, or dragged into a trash folder. You cannot ignore a half-inch thick stack of irrefutable evidence dropped directly onto your dinner plate. I reached into my bottom desk drawer and retrieved a heavy-duty manila envelope. I began assembling the dossier, organizing the pages with the meticulous precision of a trial exhibit. Exhibit A consisted of the forged home equity line of credit execution page. I used a bright yellow marker to highlight the fraudulent signature resting above my printed name. Behind that page, I attached the IP address logs I had secured through a back-channel data broker. The routing data tethered the digital application directly to the physical modem located in Richard Cole's primary commercial office. The fraud did not originate from a nameless hacker in a foreign country. It originated from his mahogany desk. Exhibit B contained the banking confirmation from the $40,000 wire transfer I had initiated months ago. Next to that receipt, I placed the Rhode Island Division of Motor Vehicles commercial lease registration for Serena's black SUV. The timestamps aligned flawlessly. The emergency funds I wired to save his firm from a fictitious federal tax lien matched the required corporate down payment for her heated leather seats. Exhibit C held the legacy lies. I printed a high-resolution scan of the fake college promissory note Richard kept framed on his office wall. I placed it side by side with the federal student loan statements I had carried like a lead weight for a decade. The stark contrast between his fictional generosity and my actual debt painted a clear, undeniable portrait of his character. I aligned the edges of the paper, tapping them against the quartz countertop to form a flush stack. I slid the documents into the envelope and wrapped the red string around the closure tab. It felt heavy in my hands. It held the sum total of my father's corporate sins. Julian navigated his truck through the morning traffic of downtown Providence. We parked near the financial district and rode a silent, polished elevator up to the 14th floor of a boutique litigation firm. I did not hire a family law attorney. I hired a former federal prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime and asset recovery. His name was David. He wore a sharp gray suit and possessed the calculating, unbothered demeanor of a man who dismantles hedge funds for sport. We sat in his corner conference room overlooking the harbor. I slid the manila envelope across the sprawling mahogany table. David spent 20 minutes reviewing the documents in silence. The only sound in the room was the turning of pages and the distant, muffled hum of city traffic far below the glass windows. "This is airtight," David finally said, looking over the rim of his reading glasses. The IP logs tether the fraud directly to his physical office. The corporate vehicle lease traces the stolen wire funds. It is a textbook wire fraud and identity theft case. "I need a formal notice of litigation drafted today," I instructed, my voice level and calm. "I want it printed on your firm's official letterhead. I also need to file the criminal complaint with the state authorities." David folded his hands, tapping his index fingers together. "If we file the police report today, a detective might pay your father a visit before the weekend concludes. He will panic, retain defense counsel, and attempt to freeze the narrative. If you want maximum impact, we embargo the arrest." I leaned forward in my leather chair. "Explain the mechanism." "We submit the criminal complaint to my contacts at the Economic Crimes Division," David detailed. We attach a sworn affidavit and request a hold on any warrants until Monday morning. It is a standard procedure when flight risk or evidence destruction is a concern. It gives you the weekend to execute your personal strategy at the wedding. By the time Monday arrives, his commercial assets will be frozen by the state, and he will have zero access to liquid capital to post bail. "Do it," Julian said, speaking for the first time since we entered the room. His voice held a low, protective resonance that echoed off the glass walls. "Draft the notice and secure the embargo." We left the law firm and walked back to Julian's truck. The Rhode Island air felt crisp, carrying the sharp scent of impending autumn. I climbed into the passenger seat and closed the heavy door. The sound of the street traffic faded into a dull hum. I stared at the dashboard. The adrenaline that had fueled my midnight audit and the morning legal consultation suddenly evaporated. A hollow, heavy ache bloomed in the center of my chest. Grief operates through a strange mechanism. You can mourn people who are still breathing. Sitting in the quiet cabin of the truck, the full reality of the situation crashed over me. I was not just dismantling a corrupt real estate developer. I was permanently severing ties with my parents. I was mourning the mother and father I never had, the ones who should have protected my foundation, instead of viewing my credit score as a resource to plunder. My hands gripped the edge of my leather tote bag. My knuckles turned white under the strain. My breath hitched a sharp, jagged inhale that betrayed the clinical facade I maintained for the outside world. Julian did not offer hollow platitudes. He did not tell me everything would magically improve or that my parents might experience a sudden revelation. He understood that false hope is a dangerous poison. Instead, he reached across the center console and wrapped his large, calloused hand around both of mine. His grip was steady, grounding me to the present reality. "You are allowed to grieve the family you deserved," Julian said quietly, keeping his eyes fixed on mine. "But you will not let the family you actually got drag you under the surface. I am right here." The ache in my chest shifted. The sorrow remained, but the paralyzing fear vanished. I squeezed his hand. I had spent 32 years trying to balance an unpayable ledger. Julian offered me a partnership with 0 debts attached. The contrast solidified my resolve, turning my grief into cold, focused armor. The countdown to the wedding weekend commenced. Over the next 48 hours, the tension in my condo grew delicious and sharp. Every phone call from my mother regarding the floral arrangements, every passive-aggressive text message from Serena complaining about the fabric of her bridesmaid dress felt like watching actors perform on a stage built over a trap door. They believed they controlled the board. Richard thought his strategy was flawless. He assumed his shadow lenders would mingle at my reception, impressed by the opulent Bristol estate. He believed his surprise invoice would force me to capitulate out of sheer public embarrassment. He banked on my lifelong habit of maintaining the peace to save his sinking ship. The dramatic irony was staggering. The audience watching this unfold knows the lethal truth. They know the quiet, obedient daughter is walking into the venue carrying a financial guillotine in her clutch purse. Richard is strolling into a slaughterhouse, admiring the decor, entirely blind to the execution scheduled for Saturday evening. Friday afternoon arrived. Julian loaded our luggage into the back of his truck. I tucked the thick manila envelope into my overnight bag, zipping the canvas shut. The forensic preparation was finished. The legal documents were drafted. The police report was filed and held in the vault until Monday. I looked in the hallway mirror, smoothing the lapels of my tailored blazer. The girl who cried over a yellow legal pad no longer existed. The accountant staring back was ready to audit her father's soul. The trap was fully armed. All I had to do was smile, nod, and let my family dig their own graves at the rehearsal dinner. The evening sun cast a long, golden reflection across Narragansett Bay as Julian and I pulled into the crushed stone parking lot of a renowned waterfront seafood restaurant. The venue sat perched on wooden pylons directly over the dark tidal water, offering panoramic views of the Newport Bridge. Inside the private dining room hummed with the low, polite chatter of 50 guests. My soon-to-be in-laws occupied the tables on the left side of the room. Julian's parents were retired high school educators from Portland, Maine. They wore practical wool sweaters and possessed warm, weathered faces shaped by decades of genuine laughter. They had raised 3 sons on public school salaries without ever mentioning the cost of a grocery bill or the price of winter boots. They viewed family as a sanctuary. My relatives commanded the tables on the right. Richard anchored the center table, flanked by Evelyn and Serena. They projected an aura of curated perfection. Evelyn wore a navy blue silk shift dress, her diamond earrings catching the ambient light. Serena sat scrolling through her social media feeds, bored and visibly detached from the celebration. They viewed family as a corporate asset. The contrast between the two sides of the room was stark. It was the visual representation of a merger between 2 entirely incompatible cultures. The waitstaff cleared the dinner plates. The clatter of silverware subsided. A waiter topped off the water glasses while another poured coffee. Richard stood up from his chair. He buttoned his tailored gray suit jacket and smoothed his silk tie. He picked up a half-empty glass of Cabernet Sauvignon and tapped a spoon against the crystal rim. The sharp ringing sound silenced the room. He did not walk to the front of the room. He stood at his table, projecting his voice to ensure he commanded the space. "If I could have everyone's attention," Richard began adopting his practiced boardroom cadence. "I want to say a few words about the bride." Julian reached under the table and rested his hand on my thigh. His thumb traced a slow, calming circle over the fabric of my dress. I kept my posture rigid, my face arranged in a mask of polite anticipation. My leather briefcase sat on the floor directly next to my heel. Inside that bag, secured under a heavy brass zipper, the manila envelope waited. "Parenting is a complex endeavor," Richard announced, pacing slowly behind his chair. "It requires strategic planning, risk assessment, and long-term vision." When Norabelle was born, I knew she would test the boundaries of our operational model. She was a difficult child, stubborn, independent to a fault. She challenged the infrastructure at every turn. I watched Julian's mother exchange a bewildered glance with her husband. Normal fathers talk about the day their daughters learned to ride a bicycle, or the proud moment they walked across a graduation stage. Richard talked about me as if I were a volatile hedge fund he had struggled to domesticate. But we provided the foundation, Richard continued, his voice rising, projecting a manufactured martyrdom. "We laid the groundwork. We funded her education. We financed the stability required to produce the woman sitting before you today. I poured immense resources into her future, often sacrificing my own capital to ensure her success." The hypocrisy rolled off his tongue with sickening ease. He stood in a rented room wearing a bespoke suit, bragging about funding an education he never paid a dime for. He claimed he sacrificed his capital, while a forged home equity line of credit bled my condo dry to keep his empty shell companies afloat. "In the commercial sector, we evaluate an asset based on its potential yield," Richard said, raising his wine glass higher. "I look at Norabelle tonight, and I see one of my most challenging, but ultimately stable investments." A heavy, uncomfortable silence settled over the room. The guests from Maine stared at him, their faces frozen in a mix of confusion and mounting horror. This was a rehearsal dinner toast, and the father of the bride was speaking like an aggressive venture capitalist presenting a quarterly earnings report to a hostile board of directors. Richard mistook their stunned silence for rapt attention. He leaned forward, flashing a brilliant, predatory smile. Of course, he chuckled a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the glass windows overlooking the bay. "The market has been volatile lately, and frankly, I am still waiting to see my return on investment. Let us hope the dividends start paying out soon." He raised his glass toward Julian. "Good luck, son. You are taking over a complex portfolio." He drank the wine. Evelyn clapped a slow, polite sequence of applause, nodding her approval of his horrific corporate metaphor. Serena did not clap. She held her smartphone high in the air, the red recording light blinking steadily. She swept the camera lens across the room, capturing the stunned faces of the guests, before zooming in on my rigid profile. She was live streaming the insult to her microscopic digital audience, mining my public humiliation for aesthetic content. I did not break character. I did not flinch. I picked up my crystal goblet filled with sparkling water, raised it toward my father, and offered a tight, slow smile. Sitting there under the warm ambient lights of the restaurant, an intense, profound clarity washed over me. I felt the physical weight of my childhood evaporate. I saw the ghost of a 12-year-old girl sitting at a kitchen island, choking down plain, dry toast because she believed she was a burden on the ledger. That girl was finally dead. The forensic accountant had taken her place. The dramatic irony filling the room was intoxicating. Richard stood there, chest puffed out, bragging about his financial dominance, entirely unaware that the daughter he viewed as a depreciating asset had already secured the evidence to dismantle his empire. He thought he was delivering a power play. He did not know he was reciting his own corporate obituary. His financial execution was scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, and he had just spent 10 minutes convincing the jury he deserved the sentence. The dinner concluded smoothly. The guests filtered out of the private dining room, heading back to their respective hotels. Julian walked his parents to their rental car, offering quiet reassurances while they processed the bizarre spectacle they had just witnessed. I grabbed my briefcase and walked to my car alone. The coastal air felt cool against my skin. I drove back to the boutique hotel in downtown Providence where the bridal party was staying for the night. I rode the elevator up to the 7th floor, the soft chime signaling my arrival. The hallway was quiet, lined with thick plush carpet that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I reached my suite, slid the key card into the electronic lock, and pushed the heavy wooden door open. I stepped inside and set my briefcase on the entryway console table. I unbuttoned my blazer, craving the quiet solitude of the room after enduring 3 hours of my family's toxic theater. Before the heavy door could swing shut and latch, a manicured hand shot through the gap, stopping the deadbolt from engaging. The door shoved open, slamming against the interior wall. Serena stepped into my hotel room. She carried a massive designer tote bag over her shoulder. She did not ask permission to enter. She bypassed me entirely, walking straight into the center of the suite, inspecting the vaulted ceiling and the expensive mid-century modern furniture with a critical eye. "You booked the penthouse suite for yourself?" Serena asked, dropping her heavy tote bag onto the velvet sofa. "Mom said you were just getting a standard double." Typical Norabelle, always hoarding the premium upgrades for yourself while the rest of the family makes do. I closed the door behind her. I leaned against the entryway wall, crossing my arms. "What do you want, Serena? It is past 11. The rehearsal dinner is over." She turned to face me. The smug entitlement that usually masked her features was replaced by a sharp, aggressive desperation. "I need your honeymoon tickets," Serena demanded. She did not phrase it as a question. She delivered an order. "The first-class flights to Greece. Transfer the reservations into my name tonight." I stared at her. The sheer audacity of the demand momentarily short-circuited my logic. "Excuse me? My aesthetic brand is plateauing." Serena snapped, pacing across the expensive rug. "My engagement metrics are plummeting because I have not posted luxury travel content in 6 months. I need a mental health break. A week in Santorini will revitalize my grid. You and Julian can go to Maine or whatever cheap cabin he usually rents. You do not appreciate high-end travel anyway. You want me to hand over the first-class international flights I paid for to fund your fake social media career?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously flat. Serena planted her hands on her hips, her eyes narrowing. "Do not act so high and mighty. Dad said you owe the family anyway for all the capital he spent raising you. He told us he is doing a public accounting at the reception tomorrow to put you in your place. So just hand over the booking confirmation numbers now, and maybe he will go easy on you during the speeches." The dinner ended smoothly, but Serena wasn't finished. She followed me back to my hotel room with a demand so audacious it almost broke my composure. The sheer audacity of Serena's demand hung in the quiet air of the hotel suite. She stood in the center of the plush rug, one hand resting aggressively on her hip, waiting for me to surrender thousands of dollars in international airfare so she could stage photographs by the Aegean Sea. My mind raced. Serena was not just acting as an entitled sibling. She was acting as an emissary for a corrupt system. By demanding the honeymoon tickets, she confirmed she viewed my personal assets as community property available for plunder. More importantly, her threat regarding Richard's planned public accounting at the reception verified the intelligence I had gathered. The ambush was not a hypothetical risk. It was an active, scheduled operation. "You want my flights to Greece?" I stated, breaking the silence. My voice lacked any inflection. I spoke with the clinical detachment of an auditor reading a balance sheet. "Because your aesthetic brand is plateauing. Do not patronize me," Serena snapped, her posture rigid. "You sit in your glass office counting other people's money, and you think you are superior. You do not understand the pressure of maintaining a digital presence. If I do not post high-yield lifestyle content, by the end of the month, I lose 2 major sponsorship deals. I need a mental health break. The Aegean light is perfect for my grid layout." She stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam she inherited directly from Richard. "The sides," she sneered. "Dad said you owe the family anyway for all the resources he exhausted raising you." He showed Mom the numbers. "He is planning a public accounting at the reception tomorrow night to finally put you in your place. So just transfer the booking confirmation to my email now, and maybe he will go easy on the itemized details during the speeches. Consider it a down payment on your debt." She weaponized the impending public humiliation, attempting to extort my honeymoon as a preemptive bribe. I took a slow breath, preparing to dismantle her logic. But before I could utter a single word, the heavy wooden door to the master bedroom swung open. Julian stepped into the main living area. He wore dark gray sweatpants and a plain black t-shirt. He had clearly been resting, but his eyes were sharp and wide awake. He did not rush into the room. He walked with a slow, deliberate cadence, his bare feet silent on the expensive carpet. He stopped a few feet away from Serena. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice or issue a counter-threat. He simply crossed his arms over his broad chest, planted his feet firmly on the floor, and stared down at her. Julian possessed the quiet, immovable gravity of a deep ocean current. He was a man who spent his days studying the relentless forces of nature. He recognized a superficial storm when he saw one. He did not speak a single word. He applied the most terrifying weapon in his arsenal: absolute, chilling silence. Serena's aggressive posture faltered. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat under the weight of his unwavering stare. The coastal Rhode Island entitlement that fueled her demands evaporated when confronted by a man who refused to play her transactional games. Julian's silence stripped away her power. It communicated a singular, undeniable truth: she had zero leverage in this room. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She glanced at me, seeking a reaction, but I remained leaning against the wall, mirroring Julian's stoic demeanor. The silence stretched, expanding until it filled every corner of the suite. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Serena's face flushed a deep, humiliating red. She grabbed the strap of her oversized designer tote bag, hoisting it back onto her shoulder. "Whatever," Serena muttered, her voice tight and defensive. She broke eye contact with Julian, unable to sustain the pressure of his gaze. "Have a mediocre trip to Europe. The lighting there is terrible in October anyway." She turned on her heel, marched toward the entryway, and practically threw herself out of the suite. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her. I immediately stepped forward and threw the deadbolt. I slid the brass chain lock into place for good measure. I turned around and looked at Julian. The tension drained out of his shoulders. He walked over to me and wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me into a tight, grounded embrace. "She confirmed the ambush," Julian murmured into my hair, his voice a low rumble. "Your father is bringing the ledger to the reception." "Yes," I replied, resting my forehead against his chest. "He is planning a public accounting. He thinks he can humiliate me in front of the shadow lenders." I pulled away from his embrace and walked over to my leather briefcase resting on the console table. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my laptop. I carried it over to the small writing desk near the window and opened the lid. The screen glowed, casting a pale blue light across the dark room. I entered my encryption passwords and opened the master spreadsheet titled The Ledger. I scrolled past the fake college promissory note. I bypassed the $40,000 emergency wire transfer stolen for the corporate Range Rover lease. I skipped over the $150,000 forged home equity line of credit. I reached the bottom of the active document. I clicked on a fresh, blank row. I typed in the date and the exact time, 11:15 p.m. Under the description column, I logged Serena's extortion attempt. Demand for international first-class airfare. Estimated value, $12,000. Extortion leverage. Threat of public humiliation at wedding reception via Richard Cole. I saved the file. I closed the laptop. The final piece of intelligence had been acquired. My family had explicitly mapped out their strategy for the following evening. They believed they held all the cards. They did not realize they had just handed the opposing general their entire playbook. I walked back to the bedroom. Julian was already under the covers reading a paperback novel. I slid into bed next to him. He turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. We did not discuss the impending collision. We both understood the architecture of the trap I had built. I closed my eyes and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of an auditor who knows the math is perfectly balanced. The morning of the wedding arrived with crisp autumn clarity. The sky over Providence was a brilliant, sharp blue, devoid of clouds. I woke early, feeling a strange, calm focus settle over my mind. The bridal party gathered in a massive rented suite on the ground floor of the hotel to begin preparations. The room buzzed with the chaotic energy typical of a wedding morning. Makeup artists arranged their palettes near the sprawling windows. Hairstylists plugged in curling irons. My university friends laughed and poured mimosas into plastic flutes. I sat in a low armchair near the corner watching the activity with a detached, clinical observation. My white satin dress hung in a protective garment bag near the closet door. My white clutch purse rested on the side table next to me. At 9 o'clock, the suite door swung open. My mother, Evelyn, swept into the room. The cheerful chatter of the bridesmaids died instantly. Evelyn was not wearing a standard mother of the bride outfit. She wore a floor-length, icy pale champagne gown. The fabric was heavy silk adorned with intricate lace detailing along the bodice. To the naked eye, under the bright morning sunlight streaming through the windows, the dress photographed completely white. It was a blatant, aggressive violation of standard wedding etiquette. It was a power play, designed to draw attention away from the bride and center the focus on the matriarch. My bridesmaids stared in stunned silence. Tina, my maid of honor, opened her mouth to object, her face flushing with protective anger. I caught Tina's eye and offered a microscopic shake of my head. I refused to grant Evelyn the satisfaction of a reaction. The dress was a petty visual distraction. I was focused on a much larger execution. Evelyn ignored the tense atmosphere she had just created. She walked directly over to my armchair. She did not offer a hug. She did not tell me I looked beautiful or express any maternal joy. She reached into her quilted handbag and pulled out a long, narrow piece of paper. It was a physical, itemized receipt printed from the hotel lobby cafe. Serena had just confirmed the ambush. The sun rose on my wedding day, and my mother decided to be the first one to hand me a bill. Evelyn stood over my armchair, the icy champagne fabric of her gown pooling around her designer heels. She thrust the narrow strip of thermal receipt paper toward me. The black printed ink starkly contrasted against the bright morning light flooding the bridal suite. I did not reach for it immediately. I looked at the receipt, then slowly trailed my gaze up to her face. Evelyn wore a tight artificial smile, a mask constructed entirely of high society entitlement. "What is this?" I asked, my voice devoid of any emotional inflection. "Just a little housekeeping, darling," Evelyn sang, pitching her voice loud enough to ensure the entire room of bridesmaids heard her. "I took the liberty of covering the artisan bagel platter and the premium mimosa bar for your bridal party this morning. I also tipped the makeup artists. They do charge an exorbitant early morning fee, you know." She waved the receipt slightly, the paper crinkling in the quiet room. I need you to open your Venmo application and process the reimbursement transfer immediately. Your father has a tight lock on the liquid capital this weekend for the networking gala. He prefers a balanced daily ledger. The silence in the bridal suite was absolute. Tina, my maid of honor, stood frozen near the vanity mirror, holding a curling iron in midair. The other bridesmaids exchanged horrified glances. A mother of the bride arriving in a white gown is a gross social faux pas. A mother of the bride demanding immediate electronic reimbursement for breakfast pastries on the morning of her daughter's wedding is a profound psychological insult. Evelyn thrived on this specific brand of humiliation. She engineered the interaction to publicly diminish my autonomy in front of my closest friends. She wanted to remind everyone in the room that regardless of my professional success or impending marriage, I remained a subordinate line item on Richard Cole's corporate spreadsheet. She expected me to flush with embarrassment. She anticipated I would scramble for my phone, hastily typing in my banking credentials to settle a petty $200 breakfast tab, just to make her walk away. I did not flush. I did not scramble. I reached out and took the receipt from her manicured fingers. I smoothed the crumpled thermal paper against my knee. I read the itemized charges. Lox, capers, orange juice, 2 bottles of mid-tier sparkling wine. Gratuity. The total sat at the bottom, printed in the same bold ink my father used for his commercial invoices. I folded the receipt perfectly in half. Then I folded it again. I picked up my small white satin clutch resting on the side table next to my chair. The clutch was deceptively heavy. It contained the thick manila envelope holding the IP address logs, the corporate vehicle lease registration, and the forged home equity line of credit documents. I unsnapped the brass clasp. I slid the folded bagel receipt into the primary compartment. It rested flush against a secondary piece of physical evidence I had acquired earlier in the week. 4 days prior, I had visited my father's commercial office under the pretense of retrieving a box of childhood photographs for a wedding slideshow. While Richard was occupied on a phone call with an aggressive vendor, I slipped into his private mahogany study. I stood before the wall of real estate awards. I reached up and unhooked the matte black frame holding the original college promissory note, the ultimate Chekhov's gun. I tucked it into my leather tote bag and walked out the front door. He was so disorganized, so distracted by his crumbling empire, he never noticed the blank space on his wall. The framed contract now sat securely inside my bridal suite luggage, ready to be deployed alongside the manila envelope. I snapped the white satin clutch shut. The metallic click echoed sharply in the silent room. I looked up at Evelyn. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy, precise cadence of an executive managing a hostile corporate takeover. "I will settle all my tabs tonight, Mom," I said smoothly. "Every single one." Evelyn's artificial smile wavered for a fraction of a second. She did not comprehend the dual meaning embedded in my statement. She processed the interaction through her narrow, narcissistic lens. She assumed she had secured a victory. She forced a curt nod, smoothed the front of her white gown, and retreated to a corner of the suite to inspect her makeup in a handheld mirror. The tension in the room slowly dissipated as the stylists resumed their work. Tina walked over to my armchair and crouched down, her voice a low, fierce whisper. "I will transfer her the money right now," Tina offered, her eyes blazing with protective fury. "I will pay the breakfast bill. Do not let her pull this petty extortion today, Norabel. It is your wedding." I placed my hand gently over Tina's. I appreciated her loyalty. She was a true friend navigating the bizarre terrain of the Cole family with fierce dedication. But she did not understand the scale of the impending collision. "Keep your money, Tina," I replied softly. "The breakfast bill is irrelevant. It is just another piece of data for the final audit. Let her think she holds the leverage." The hours leading up to the ceremony passed in a blur of hairspray-pinned silk and the nervous, excited energy of my bridal party. The logistics ran flawlessly. The zero-trust architecture I had implemented with the vendors held strong. Evelyn attempted to alter the floral arrangements in the main entryway, but the florist required my verbal authorization code to process the change. Denied access. Evelyn sulked in the bridal suite, complaining loudly about the lack of aesthetic vision. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the photographer arrived. I stepped behind a folding screen and carefully pulled my wedding dress off the padded hanger. It was a minimalist design: heavy ivory silk, an elegant boat neckline, and a structured bodice devoid of excessive beading or lace. I selected the gown because it lacked the performative theatricality my family favored. It was clean. It was armor. I stepped into the silk and allowed Tina to fasten the hidden row of buttons along the spine. I slid my feet into comfortable leather heels. I checked my reflection in the full-length mirror. My posture was rigid. My spine held a stark, unnatural straightness. My eyes lacked the soft, dreamy haze depicted in bridal magazines. I recognized the reflection staring back at me. I put on my silk gown. I wasn't a bride getting ready for a party. I was a senior auditor walking into a hostile boardroom. The sea breeze blowing off Narragansett Bay carried the faint, sharp scent of salt and crushed pine needles. I stood in the grand foyer of the Bristol Estate mansion, waiting for the heavy oak doors to open toward the manicured lawn. The string quartet positioned near the altar tuned their instruments, the low resonance of a cello vibrating through the ancient stone floor beneath my heels. The estate coordinator, a severe woman dressed in a stark black suit, approached me, holding a wireless communication earpiece. "Miss Cole," she whispered, glancing around the empty foyer with a hint of nervous energy. "The processional is queuing. We need to stage your father beside you for the escort down the runner." "I am walking alone," I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. The coordinator blinked, her professional composure fracturing for a brief microsecond. Standard protocol usually dictates a paternal escort for the bride. My protocol dictates a solo procession. I interrupted, smoothly adjusting the heavy silk fabric of my gown. "Signal the musicians to begin the primary march." The heavy oak doors swung outward on well-oiled hinges. Brilliant afternoon sunlight spilled into the shadowy foyer, blinding me momentarily before my vision adjusted to the sprawling outdoor ceremony space. 80 guests sat in white wooden folding chairs, arranged in perfect geometric rows upon the vibrant green grass. The quartet transitioned into a slow, haunting arrangement of a classical piece. I stepped onto the pristine white fabric runner. I did not link my arm through a patriarch's elbow. I did not participate in the archaic tradition of a man transferring ownership of a female asset to a new proprietor. I walked under my own power, my posture rigid, my gaze fixed straight ahead toward the altar. The collective inhale of the gathered audience was audible over the sweeping music. Whispers rippled through the right side of the aisle. The Cole family network processed the visual data with ruthless efficiency. A bride walking unescorted when her father is present and physically capable is a calculated public slight. It is a broadcasted rejection of his authority. I kept my chin level, but my peripheral vision tracked the front row. Richard sat on the aisle seat. The tailored shoulders of his expensive gray suit were pulled tight, the seams straining against his rigid posture. A dark, furious red flush crept out from the stiff collar of his dress shirt, staining his neck and jawline. His hands rested on his knees, his knuckles pale from the intense strain of his grip. He recognized the optics immediately. He understood I had stripped him of the performative paternal role he craved for his public image. He was denied the opportunity to play the benevolent, generous patriarch in front of his shadow lenders and zoning board politicians sitting just a few rows behind him. The networking gala he envisioned was already unraveling. I glided past him, leaving him stewing in the turbulent wake of my independence. At the end of the white runner stood Julian. He wore a classic charcoal suit, his broad shoulders relaxed, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He did not look at the whispering guests. He did not glance at my seething father. Julian kept his eyes locked entirely on me. His expression radiated a profound, steady warmth that anchored me against the chaotic, toxic energy radiating from the right side of the lawn. I reached the altar. Julian stepped forward, taking both of my hands in his. His palms were warm, rough, with the familiar calluses earned from working on the coastal waters. The officiant began the ceremony, delivering eloquent words about commitment and enduring partnerships. I tuned out the standard boilerplate language, focusing solely on the man standing opposite me. When the time arrived for personal vows, Julian did not pull a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. He spoke directly from his chest, his deep voice carrying effortlessly over the gentle rustle of the wind moving through the ancient oak trees. Norabelle Julian began holding my gaze with an unwavering intensity that made the surrounding crowd fade into background noise. I spent my life studying the tides. I know how unpredictable currents can be, how quickly a sudden storm can erode a solid foundation. But you are the strongest structure I have ever encountered. He paused, his thumbs brushing gently against the backs of my hands. I cannot promise a life free of complications. Julian continued, his tone dropping to a resonant, intimate register. But I swear on everything I am that my love comes with 0 conditions. I will never keep a ledger on your mistakes. I will never calculate what you owe me. This partnership is a safe harbor. Everything I have is yours, given freely, with no receipts required. Soft tears welled in the eyes of Julianne's mother sitting in the second row. Her quiet sniffles echoed in the stillness of the afternoon. Julianne had effectively summarized my specific trauma and offered the exact antidote, delivering the message without ever explicitly exposing the Cole family to the uninitiated guests. He spoke in a code only he and I truly understood, though Richard and Evelyn surely felt the sharp sting of the vocabulary. It was my turn. I looked at Julian, letting the rigid armor I had worn all morning soften for a singular, finite moment. I took a slow breath, filling my lungs with the crisp autumn air. Julian, I replied, my voice clear and projecting perfectly across the quiet lawn. For a very long time, I believed affection was a transaction. I thought every kindness was a loan waiting to be collected with interest. I built immense digital walls to protect myself from debts I never agreed to assume. I tightened my grip on his hands, drawing strength from his physical proximity. You showed me an entirely different economy, I stated, locking my eyes with his. You taught me that genuine devotion does not demand a return on investment. You gave me the courage to close out the old accounts and start fresh. I vow to protect our peace, to value our shared silence, and to love you without a single hidden motive. I choose this life with you, free of hidden costs and invisible strings. My mother sat in her icy champagne gown just a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was an unreadable mask of cold granite. She recognized the subtext. Serena rolled her eyes, adjusting her posture to ensure her profile looked favorable for the hired photographer. The officiant smiled warmly, concluding the final procedural elements of the script. By the power vested in me by the state of Rhode Island, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Julian leaned in. His kiss was firm, grounding, and devoid of any performative exaggeration. It was a private promise delivered in a highly public space. I opened my eyes as we parted. My gaze naturally drifted over Julian's shoulder, sweeping across the front row of white folding chairs. Richard was no longer looking at the altar. He was staring directly at me, his eyes narrowed into dark, hostile slits. He did not clap. He did not smile. He sat perfectly still amidst the rising applause of the guests from Maine. Instead, he raised his right hand and patted the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. The gray wool fabric pulled taut across his chest. Through the expensive material, I could clearly see the distinct, rectangular outline of a thick, folded manila envelope. He tapped the pocket twice, a deliberate, calculated gesture designed specifically to catch my attention. It was a silent, physical threat. He was reminding me that he held his own version of the ledger, and he intended to serve it before the night concluded. He believed the package inside his coat contained the necessary leverage to break my composure. He believed the impending networking gala would trap me in a cage of social compliance, forcing me to swallow his demands to avoid a public scene. He had no idea the small white satin clutch waiting for me at the sweetheart table housed a financial guillotine. Julian intertwined his fingers with mine. We turned together to face the audience, stepping back onto the white fabric runner as the string quartet launched into an upbeat, triumphant recessional. The sacred part of the day was over. The music shifted, the guests moved toward the sprawling reception tent, and the corporate execution was about to begin. The coastal sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of purple and indigo. Inside the sprawling sailcloth tent, warm ambient light radiated from heavy crystal chandeliers suspended high above the polished oak dance floor. The clatter of silverware against fine china subsided as the catering staff silently cleared the final dessert plates from the tables. The atmosphere in the room hummed with post-dinner contentment. Julian's family laughed loudly over coffee, while my university friends mingled near the open bar. Even the shadow lenders and gray market investors Richard had dragged to the event appeared relaxed, sipping expensive scotch and admiring the opulent floral arrangements I had paid for. The DJ stationed near the corner of the tent adjusted his audio mixer, a soft crackle of static echoing briefly through the massive speakers. He cued the opening melody for the first dance. The smooth, introductory piano notes of a classic jazz standard began to fill the space. A sharp, piercing screech of microphone feedback instantly severed the music. 80 guests flinched, turning their heads toward the sound. Richard stood directly in front of the DJ booth. He had bypassed the head table entirely, abandoning the standard protocol for wedding toasts. He gripped a wireless microphone in his right hand, his knuckles white with tension. The DJ, a young man hired through a strict agency contract, looked terrified. Richard had physically intimidated him, stepping into his workspace to rip the microphone from its stand. "Cut the track," Richard commanded, his voice booming over the speaker system. The DJ scrambled to pause the music. A heavy, sudden silence dropped over the tent like a physical weight. Richard did not smile. He did not adopt the charming, performative mask he wore during the rehearsal dinner. He projected a bitter, aggressive energy, his jaw locked, his eyes scanning the crowd with a dark, predatory focus. He looked past the tables filled with my friends and Julian's family, his gaze locking directly onto his invited investors sitting near the center aisle. He was performing for his creditors, attempting to reestablish dominance in a room where he had been publicly sidelined earlier that afternoon. "We gather here to celebrate a union." Richard began, his tone sharp and devoid of warmth. "We toast to the future. But a future requires capital. It requires a foundation, and foundations are rarely built on gratitude." Julian stiffened beside me at the sweetheart table, his jaw flexed. He did not interrupt, but his hand moved under the tablecloth, finding my knee and resting there in a solid, grounding grip. I spent decades operating a commercial enterprise. Richard continued pacing slowly across the edge of the dance floor. "I understand the mechanics of investment. I know how to evaluate a complex portfolio. But the most unpredictable, volatile asset a man can ever attempt to manage is his own ungrateful offspring." A collective horrified murmur rippled through the tent. Julian's mother covered her mouth with her napkin. My maid of honor, Tina, half stood from her chair before her boyfriend pulled her gently back down. This was no longer a slightly inappropriate speech. It was a hostile, public execution designed to humiliate me in front of my peers. I exhausted immense resources raising Norabelle. Richard spat, his voice echoing off the canvas ceiling. I funded her private education. I financed her stability. I sacrificed my own corporate liquidity to ensure she walked out of my house with a pristine credit score and a marketable degree. I built the very infrastructure she used to secure her fancy downtown corner office. He stopped pacing. He turned and stared directly at me. The venom in his eyes was unmistakable. He reached his left hand inside his tailored gray suit jacket. "But capital requires a return," Richard announced into the microphone, "and when an asset matures, the initial investor is entitled to collect the dividend. It is a simple matter of balancing the ledger." He pulled a thick manila envelope from his breast pocket. He marched across the dance floor, bypassing the horrified guests, and stopped directly in front of the sweetheart table. He dropped the envelope squarely onto my dinner plate. The package landed with a flat, undeniable thud against the white porcelain. "It is time we settled up," Norabel Richard demanded, his voice carrying clearly without the aid of the speakers. I did not flinch. I slid my thumbnail under the unsealed flap and pulled out a single sheet of Cole Realty corporate letterhead. The paper was heavy, expensive cardstock. At the bottom, aligned in perfect Arial font, sat a bolded total: $315,000. Underneath the number, a typed memo read, "Parental expenses, payable upon marriage." I looked up. 2 tables away, my mother Evelyn sat, swirling a vodka martini, her lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. My younger sister Serena held her phone at chest level, the camera lens pointed directly at my face, recording the ambush for her digital audience. They expected me to crumble. They expected tears, followed by quiet, panicked compliance to avoid a screaming match in front of his wealthy investors. I placed the Cole Realty invoice flat on the linen tablecloth. I stood up. I smoothed the heavy ivory silk of my gown. I picked up the secondary wireless microphone resting on the sweetheart table, flipped the power switch, and met my father's gaze. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice projecting crisp and level over the speaker system. I deliberately utilized his first name. "I appreciate you bringing the accounting to the forefront tonight. Transparency is vital in any corporate merger." Richard blinked, his confident posture faltering for a microsecond. He expected weeping or a whispered plea for privacy. He did not anticipate a clinical forensic response. "Let us examine this specific number," I continued, holding the invoice up for the room to see. $315,000. It is a precise figure. Most parents estimating childhood expenses would round to a clean $250,000. But you itemized it down to the penny. I walked around the sweetheart table and stepped onto the edge of the dance floor, mirroring his earlier pacing. I spoke directly to the 80 guests sitting in stunned silence. "You see, $315,000 is not a random calculation of private school tuitions or grocery bills," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "It is a highly specific deficit. It is the exact amount Cole Realty owes the Internal Revenue Service." The room froze. A sharp inhale echoed from the table where the gray market lenders sat. Marcus Vance, the shadow investor, sat up straight, his drink pausing halfway to his mouth. The word IRS is toxic radiation in commercial real estate circles. "My father is not asking for reimbursement for my childhood," I stated clearly, turning to look directly at Marcus Vance. "He is utilizing this wedding reception to publicly extort me, hoping the social pressure will force me to write a check so he can avoid a federal indictment for tax evasion. His empire is entirely insolvent. His commercial signs are rusting because his shell companies are bankrupt." Richard turned a sickly shade of gray. The tailored lines of his suit suddenly looked absurd against his panicked expression. "Norabel, shut your mouth," he hissed, stepping toward me. "You do not know what you are talking about." "I am a senior forensic auditor, Richard," I replied, my voice dropping to a lethal calm register. "I build timelines out of bank statements. I know exactly what I am talking about." I turned back to the sweetheart table. I picked up my small white satin clutch. I popped the brass clasp. I did not pull out paper first. I reached in and grasped the rigid edge of the matte black frame I had stolen from his office wall 4 days ago. I lifted the framed college promissory note high in the air. This is the foundational lie I declared into the microphone. This is the contract he forced me to sign at 18, promising to pay my university tuition if I repaid him after graduation. He kept it framed on his office wall for a decade to remind me of the debt. I swung my arm downward with sharp, brutal force. I slammed the frame flat against the edge of the heavy oak sweetheart table. The glass shattered. A violent, jagged sound cracked through the quiet tent. Splinters of glass rained down onto the grass below. Evelyn screamed a short, terrified yelp, dropping her martini glass. Serena lowered her phone, her mouth hanging open in shock. I pulled the torn promissory note from the broken frame and held it up. He took the tax deduction for my tuition, pocketed the cash to fund his failing properties, and never sent a dime to the university. I paid for my own education entirely through federal student loans, while he bragged to his country club friends about his generosity. I dropped the torn contract onto his fake invoice. The room gasped as the glass broke. The sheer violence of the action from a typically quiet bride paralyzed the audience. But dismantling his fake invoice was just the appetizer. I pulled out my manila envelope for the main course. I unwound the red string securing the flap of the heavy manila envelope. The thick stack of premium bond paper slid easily into my palm. The crisp rustle of the pages sounded unnaturally loud under the quiet canopy of the sailcloth tent. 80 guests sat entirely motionless, their eyes darting between the shattered glass of the promissory note resting on the sweetheart table and the fresh documents in my hand. I pulled the first exhibit from the top of the stack. I held up a bank wire confirmation next to a Rhode Island Division of Motor Vehicles registration printout. "Last November, you called me near midnight in a manufactured panic," I said, projecting my voice across the room, locking my gaze on Richard. "You claimed Cole Realty was facing an imminent federal tax lien. You demanded a $40,000 emergency capital injection to save the family from bankruptcy. I liquidated my municipal bonds and wired you the funds." I turned my head slightly, shifting my focus to my sister. Serena sat frozen, her smartphone lowered to the table. The recording light finally extinguished. 1 week later, Serena drove off a dealership lot in a metallic black Range Rover. I stated, my tone clinical and precise. "A quick public records search confirmed the truth. You did not pay a tax lien, Richard. You used my emergency wire transfer as the corporate down payment for a luxury vehicle lease. You funneled my hard-earned savings into heated leather seats for the golden child, shielding the asset under a hollow LLC." Serena shrank back into her folding chair. The influencer facade crumbled, replaced by the terrified expression of a girl realizing her premium aesthetic was built on stolen currency. Richard opened his mouth, his face a mottled shade of crimson. "Norabel, this is neither the time nor the venue for a corporate misunderstanding. Put the papers away." "This is not a misunderstanding," I corrected, stepping away from the sweetheart table and moving directly onto the polished oak dance floor. "And we are far from finished. The $40,000 was merely an appetizer. The real reason we are settling accounts tonight centers on a much larger deficit." I pulled the second stack of documents from the envelope. 3 years ago, I announced my voice dropping to a lethal, steady register. You utilized the personal data you retained from assisting me with my post-college real estate purchase. You weaponized my Social Security number and my previous tax returns. You forged my signature and took out a $150,000 home equity line of credit against my downtown condo. The guests from Maine gasped. Julian stood tall beside the sweetheart table, his presence a silent, formidable anchor, watching the execution unfold exactly as we had planned. You pulled my equity to keep your failing commercial empire afloat. I continued holding the forged, digitized deed high in the air. You made the minimum interest payments through a shell company to ensure the secondary mortgage remained a ghost liability, never triggering my credit monitoring software. It is felony identity theft. It is severe bank fraud. And the $15,000 diamond necklace you sent me on Thursday was purchased using my own stolen equity. Richard took a stumbling step backward. The tailored lines of his suit could not hide the sudden physical collapse of his posture. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had already snapped shut. But I did not hand the evidence to my father. I bypassed him entirely. I walked straight down the center aisle, the heavy ivory silk of my gown brushing against the white wooden chairs. I stopped at table 4. Marcus Vance, the principal director of Apex Capital Lending, sat rigid in his seat. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and possessed the cold, calculating eyes of a man who makes his fortune feeding on desperate developers. He was the shadow investor Richard had invited to the reception to secure fresh capital. He was also the man holding the fraudulent lien against my property. I placed the forensic dossier directly onto the white linen tablecloth in front of him. "Mr. Vance," I said smoothly, turning off the wireless microphone so my words were meant only for him and the surrounding investors. "You run a gray market lending firm. You do not verify income, but you care deeply about securing solid collateral. I suggest you review the execution page of the deed you hold on my condo." Vance stared at me, his jaw tight. He reached out and picked up the dossier. Behind the forged signature, I instructed quietly, "You will find the digital IP address logs tracing the electronic application directly to Richard Cole's primary commercial office. You will find the routing numbers proving the dispersed funds funneled straight into his insolvent corporate accounts." Vance flipped to the third page. His eyes scanned the data. The color drained from his face as his mind processed the lethal implications. His secured collateral was entirely fraudulent. The six-figure loan he issued was backed by a felony crime, rendering his lien legally void. And on the final page, I concluded, leaning in slightly, "You will find a sworn affidavit and a formal criminal complaint. I filed it yesterday morning with the Rhode Island Economic Crimes Division. My attorney secured an embargo on the arrest warrant until Monday. By the time the banks open, the state will freeze every single asset attached to Cole Realty." I stepped back from the table. Poetic justice possesses a specific, undeniable weight. I did not need to scream at my father. I simply handed his financial sins to the predators he had invited into my sanctuary. Vance dropped the dossier onto the table. He stood up slowly. He did not look at me. He turned his gaze toward Richard. It was the look of a loan shark realizing his borrower had stolen from him. The other property investors sitting at table 4 followed suit, rising from their chairs, their expressions hardening into masks of pure financial hostility. Richard was socially and fiscally annihilated on the spot. The networking gala he engineered to save his dying empire had transformed into a creditor tribunal. He looked at the towering, angry figures of his investors, then looked at the shattered glass of the promissory note resting near his fake invoice. The illusion of his coastal wealth evaporated, leaving only a desperate, hollow man facing a federal indictment. Evelyn could not sustain the sheer, crushing humiliation. The high society prestige she valued above all else was burning to ash in front of her peers. She grabbed the icy champagne fabric of her inappropriate gown, turned on her heel, and practically ran toward the exit of the sailcloth tent. Serena scrambled out of her chair, her designer heels sinking into the grass as she sprinted after our mother, tears ruining her flawless makeup. Richard stood alone on the dance floor for a mere 5 seconds. He opened his mouth, perhaps attempting to formulate a final, desperate lie, but Marcus Vance took a single, threatening step forward. Richard broke. He turned and fled the tent, chasing his family into the dark Rhode Island night. The silence left in their wake was profound. It was not the heavy, uncomfortable silence of an awkward toast. It was the clean, breathable silence following a severe thunderstorm. I turned around and walked back to the sweetheart table. I picked up the wireless microphone and walked over to the DJ booth. The young man stood frozen, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I handed him the microphone. I offered him a calm, genuine smile. "You can start the music now," I said gently. The DJ swallowed hard, nodded, and pressed a button on his mixing board. The smooth, rich notes of the jazz standard drifted through the speakers, washing over the stunned guests and filling the cavernous space with warmth. I stepped back onto the center of the polished oak floor. Julian walked toward me. He did not ask if I was okay. He read the deep, steady peace radiating from my posture. He pulled me into his arms, resting one hand on the small of my back and intertwining his other hand with mine. We swayed to the music. The tension I had carried in my shoulders for 2 decades melted away, dissolving into the cool coastal air. Julian's family began to clap a slow building rhythm of support that broke the spell over the rest of the tent. My university friends cheered. Soon the dance floor filled with people who genuinely cared for us, celebrating a union built on an unshakable foundation. The aftermath proceeded exactly as the forensic data dictated. When Monday morning arrived, the State Economic Crimes Division executed the embargoed warrant. Detectives seized the hard drives from Cole Realty. The state froze the corporate operating accounts. Marcus Vance and the shadow lenders filed immediate, aggressive injunctions, picking the carcass of his commercial properties clean before the federal prosecutors even filed their formal indictments. Serena lost the Range Rover to a repossession agency within the month. I never answered their frantic bargaining voicemails. I forwarded every communication directly to my attorney. Juliana and I returned from our honeymoon in Greece to a quiet, peaceful condo. The forged lien was legally dissolved. I opened my encrypted laptop one final time. I deleted the master spreadsheet titled The Ledger. I dragged the file into the digital trash bin and emptied it forever. Some debts are never meant to be paid. Some invoices are just confessions waiting to be audited.